I'm very honored to be moderating this panel. I've known Rolf and Vicens for close to 10 years now, probably, right?
At least 6.
At least 6, 7, since the beginning. I've gotten to see them start, grow, and sell. So I'm very excited to be moderating this. My name is Melissa Blau. I'm an online gaming consultant working both in real money and since the inception of social. I'm mainly working with land-based casinos in the United States, helping them either partner or acquire online gaming social gaming companies and online real money, but mainly social now, because there's nothing going on in the United States with real money. So I'm going to let each one of the two panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to dive into their process about M&A.
Cool. Good morning, everyone. My name is Keustermans. I was one of the 3 founders of Plumbee, which was acquired in February by GSN Games. Based in London, we were around for around 5 years. We're still around, obviously, but under GSN right now. So it's been an interesting journey. We raised in total about 16.5 million in funding. Most of it came from Endemol TV production company, now merged and called Endemol Shine. Also another investor was ID Invest, a French VC fund. We got to around 50 people, all in all, still roughly the same size. As I said, a very interesting journey, and happy to talk more about it later on and answer any questions you might have about the journey before and after the acquisition.
Are you on?
I'm waiting for the green light. Hi, I'm Vicens. I co-founded Akamon in July 2011, same month as Raf co-founded Plumbee. We've had parallel lives, but I did raise way less money than him. I raised only 4 million. From a couple of Spanish funds, Bonsai and Action Capital. We sold the company 1 year ago, specifically to a Canadian company called Imperus, which was in the trend of all these Canadian companies raising money and buying gaming companies again. So we've been doing that for 1 year, and I'll share with you, the before and after.
Okay, well, let's start with the before, in terms of readying yourself for M&A and also the internal process that you each went through. Was it something that people approached you? Was it something that you internally turned around and said, you know what, it's time to sell, markets may be maturing, cost of acquisition is kind of getting a little toppy, so we're going to go ready ourselves to sell? Or is it like someone kind of approached you and said, I want you? So.
Yeah, I can start. In our case, I think it's always a combination, right? I think it's never that black or white. Usually over the periods of creating and building a company, you start to get in touch with other people. Like you build these relationships, you don't start building these relationships like a month before you sell, right? These things happen over years. You go to these kind of conferences, you meet people from other companies, you meet investors, you meet people that end up in executive positions at larger companies. So in our case with GSN, I've been talking with different execs at GSN over many, many years, and usually you don't start talking about an acquisition like when you're 1 year old. You start just staying in touch with people, having a beer, going to the party, building also like a personal relationship. Also, as you know, it's a small industry still, right? A lot of people move around. For example, at GSN, a lot of the people in the exec team used to work at EA. I used to work there as well many, many years ago. So you kind of build these relationships over years. So that's part of it. And in our case, I think we realized that the market was becoming more and more difficult and more mature. We saw that a lot of the companies in the top 5, top 10 were really like multi-billion-dollar companies. It makes it harder and harder to compete and to grow. That's, I think, where we started to become more open for the idea of finding a strategic corporate partnership. And at that point, we did not really settle on should we sell or should we find some other more creative way, maybe joint venture, maybe another funding round. And then you start talking with...
We discussed merging at one point, did we?
That's true, actually. Yeah. That's true, actually. Yeah, that's true. So and at some point, the conversations go in one direction or another. In our case, it ended up with the conversation with GSN becoming more and more specific about them looking to acquire us. So that's basically in a nutshell how it happens. There is no sort of like magic moment where somebody makes a decision. These things grow kind of organically over many, many years.
Pretty much the same. One couple of comments. One of them is I fully agree with Raf. This is a very, very small industry. If you do the tour of, at the conference in 1 year, you basically meet everybody. There's roughly 100 people that you need to know, 2 bankers, and a few possible acquirers. In our case, the main difference was internal. I happened to fire my partner from the executive team of Akamon, and obviously he then wanted an exit, which is very natural. It's at some point when you co-found teams with somebody, then at some point you realize that they might not getting the best value as executives, and they will get it as shareholders, and that provoked for us to be looking for an exit. It took longer than expected, so that's something to keep in mind. It took, anticipated we would sell it in 9 months, and it took basically twice as much. But it was an internal trigger for us.
And when you're making decisions about strategic decisions, do we stay in slots, do we go into multi-app, do you keep in mind the fact that, okay, I kind of have these 3 companies I would like to sell to? Does it affect your day-to-day decision making?
I don't think you should think like that. I mean, it rarely happens like that. Like, you have to be a little bit careful. Obviously, like, for example, in the very, very early days, not many people actually know this, but in the very, very early days, I'm talking 2011, when the animals could still speak, we were actually thinking, should we create 2 studios? Should we create 1 casino studio and 1 sort of like strategy game studio? We were actually very close, and still are today, with the guys from Hasbro. At that point, they were actually thinking about doing something. They were working on a Transformers MMO with Jagex, which I think never launched, unfortunately. So we were actually brainstorming a little bit with them. Should we create like 1 team working on slots, 1 team on Transformers strategy games? And that's, I think, when also the board asked us questions like, what kind of company do you want to become? Like, the initial pitch also to the investors was leveraging social casino, also leveraging the know-how from the founding team, understanding the real money space, and then opportunities potentially further down the line with those kind of guys. So that those kind of strategic decisions you have to take into account, specifically if you have external funding, like what that actually means for your position, what it actually means further down the line, like how are you still sellable? Who's going to buy you? Like, the companies looking to buy strategy game studios are typically a little bit not sure about the casino space and vice versa. So, but on a day-to-day basis, if you make a new app, I think it would be unwise to start thinking, will Zynga like this? Will GSN like this? Will Playtika like the style of my art? I think that's not really, I think, how you should run a business. I think you should really focus on trying to become a good, solid, autonomous business, and then I think figure out down the line who is the right partner for that, rather than the other way around.
So in the case of Akamon, we made, in 5 years before we sold, 4 years, I would say every mistake in the book. I mean, if you can write an encyclopedia of mistakes. But we did one thing right. And the only thing we did right is I repeated until people were sick of me that we were the leader in Southern Europe and Latin America. And I don't know if we were or not, but I said it so many times that people believed it. And I think that's the key thing. I mean, that's positioning. I'm a CEO that was a CMO once. I probably enjoyed my CMO life be better than the CEO one. And positioning is all about that. It's pick a niche that is not taken, repeat it, believe it, and people will end up believing it. And that's what we did.
And I'm sticking mainly right now into the pre-process. Bringing in your staff, bringing in your board members, bringing in your stakeholders, how do you manage that process? Because on one hand, especially if you're speaking to a publicly listed company, you have to remain silent. But how do you manage that process? Because you work with these people on a day-to-day basis, yet you're having this whole other level of meetings that will completely change their lives. So how do you manage that process? And also at what point do you bring in the people that you have to report into, which is your board members?
Well, the board, I think you have to involve them from day one. I mean, that's basically your fiduciary duty. You can't just hide these kind of conversations from the board.
During the discussions. Like, so if you're speaking to these 5 people, do you bring them in saying, here, we're speaking to these 5 people? Or do you say, this is the one I recommend?
It really depends, I think, and it's kind of, it's hard to explain, but I think it's kind of obvious when it happens. Like, if I go to a conference, like your company is 2 years old, you go to a conference, you have a beer with like a corp dev guy from a large company, and you just talk a little bit and you build a relationship. You don't have to report that to your board per se. The moment it becomes more serious, people actually start thinking about what is the price, what are you looking for, or even like further down, like an actual term sheet, or even an email saying like we are genuinely interested in pursuing a conversation with you guys. you have to get your board involved. And also, like, if you have co-founders, you can't hide these things. Like, these things are so critical. So it's hard to explain exactly the difference between a more casual conversation and a more formal one. But I think it is obvious when it actually happens what the right thing is.
There's a little bit of tension in our case because Akamon was all for transparency. We pushed transparency to boundaries that I have seen in very few companies. For example, compensation at Akamon was transparent. People knew how much I made and how much everybody else made. It was on an open file on Google Drive. And then you're putting transparency as one of the core values of the company, and then there's a few things that you cannot discuss. And that's what happened on the M&A front. Not with the board. I fully agree with Raf. With the board, is full transparency, especially on Southern European boards that are very vocal and want to know everything and will get mad if you don't share them anyway. So it's very transparent with the board, but with staff and team and employees, you basically have to wait until the end.
I think in our case, I think you can say something. Like also, like people see things, especially if you have a small office or like quite an open office, like us, it's open plan, and all our meeting rooms are basically aquariums. So you can't really, unless you constantly start going to another meeting outside. But you can say something without telling the full story. You can say like
people were wondering why I travel so much to Canada.
We're actually looking at. In our case, we actually did say it, but it was also true. Like we are looking at strategic opportunities, partnerships, and maybe these things could turn out to be an acquisition. Who knows? And we'll keep you posted to a degree. So I think you can say something. Like I think it is usually bad, specifically in smaller companies and close-knit teams, to actually completely hide it. People will start smelling something is yeah.
And so, one thing that I've seen over and over again that I'm totally surprised by is the lack of preparation when someone decides to say, hey, I'm going to entertain M&A conversations, in terms of things not being documented right, financials not being prepared correctly, legal stuff not being prepared correctly. So is there something, like some advice that you could give to the audience, especially those who are out there with smaller companies or thinking about looking at an M&A transaction? In terms of how to prepare best.
So I think we were a little bit lucky in that way that the founding team was not like 18 years old. That helps. We had corporate careers before, and one of my co-founders actually had a finance background. That also helps. But also we went through a couple of funding rounds, and basically that's where you almost like, it's like a training ground for future M&A. That's how you understand the value of like a data room process. You get proper lawyers on board. You start to see the kind of questions, specifically when you raise a larger funding round, from in our case Endemol. You start to understand the kind of things they are worried about. Things are all your contractors, your freelance copywriter, sound designer, do they have like the right contracts? Is it very clear that the IP does not belong to them but to the company? What about trademarks? Have you actually checked that you're not accidentally in breach of someone else's trademarks? In our case, actually, when we did the Endemol deal, one of the games that was in the app was called Beowulf, and Beowulf is actually a trademark from Paramount. They had a movie once, probably not many people will remember because it was a flop. But still, like Paramount still owned that trademark, and if a company like Endemol, which is paranoid about IP because that's what they do, they're not cool with that. They're not going to be like, it's going to be fine, don't worry about it. So we had to change the name of those things, which also set us up. Like GSN is similar, right? Like they're owned by Sony and AT&T. They're not casual about IP, trademarks, and so on. So these things, I think it prepared us, and I think it gave us like a good flavor of what to expect further down the line. But I think a lot of entrepreneurs, specifically in the early stages, maybe underestimate these kind of things. Like you just create a fun game, you give it a cool sounding name, you don't worry a bit too much if someone else actually has potentially rights on that name. So I think, raising money typically helps understand a little bit the process and sets you up or prepares you for a deal later on.
Basically agree. Couple of additional comments. If you are basing, as it was our case, your company in a non-English speaking country, my recipe or my advice would be run the company in English anyway. That's what we did. So every board meetings minutes, every meeting of the minutes, every presentation, internal board presentation, everything was in English anyway. So because it's very rare that you're going to get an acquire from your same geography. It might happen, but it didn't happen in our case. So that saved us a lot of time and was a decision that I took at the beginning. Second, this was the third company I sold, and I did an IPO too. So I brought a lot of experience into the rest of the founding team in how to document things, KPIs, everything. I wish, a lot of the founding teams thought about these things at the beginning. Sometimes when you see it as an investor, it's a different thing.
Yeah, I think I would say also like. being prepared and having like good financials and good documentation is not going to get you acquired, but it can actually kill a deal, or it can actually make a deal 2-3 times as long if you basically are very cavalier about your management accounts, or yeah, we haven't done them for the last 3 months, like it's not really my priority. Like you give really weird signals to potential acquirers. It's one thing if you're doing $1 billion profit a year, all of these things can be sorted out, that you will be acquired one way or another, but not many companies are in that space. A lot of companies are in the middle space where these things really matter, and they can kill a deal if investors start to feel a little bit squeezy about corporate governance, finance, how things are documented. It will have an impact on price as well. Like even if the deal happens, they will actually price the risk into it. They say like, well, a lot of these things, the trademarks, these guys actually have been breaching trademarks from large companies, even though the risk is relatively small. We're gonna have to take that into account.
Let me share a specific one, because I think some of you guys might be faced it at some point. The issue of capitalization of development cost. It's for those of you that thinking, what is he talking about? You have the option to put every development cost, every what you're paying to your engineers as a cost directly into the P&L, or you have the option in many accounting jurisdictions to capitalize it over the time of the game. My strong recommendation is expense it. Strong recommendation. Then you do what you want, obviously, but it can kill a deal, because if the buyer don't see the rationale of why you have capitalized that, basically your EBITDA number is false, and it can kill a deal.
Yeah, and also like I think specifically American companies, probably for all the right reasons, more so than I think in Europe, I think are very serious about these kind of things. Yeah. Like, and also another thing I would say, which is maybe obvious, but the moment you start to get to a certain scale, either revenue or team size, invest in the right advisors, get a really good finance director, get really good lawyers, get a proper auditor. Like in our case, maybe we overdid it a little bit, but we had PwC as our auditors from day one.
PwC too? Yeah, we had PwC too.
So like I think these things, like they really help. Like the moment someone comes in, start looking at your books, see like PwC is the auditor, it basically wipes 2 months off the process straight away, pretty much.
Right. And I think what people don't understand is that these things do go in windows. So the window does shut. So anytime you can condense that window, it's super helpful. And then I guess, because I want to make sure that I get to all the topics before we run out of time. Structuring a deal. Most of the deals in this industry are done in earnouts, which do a couple of things. One, it obviously allows you to get the maximum. It continues to incentivize you. It continues, keeps you at the company, as well as it also, though, sort of puts you at odds with your natural acquirer, because you want the highest price. They want to pay you the highest price, but they kind of don't want to pay you the highest price. So, and then you have to remain somewhat autonomous. So sometimes you can't take the benefits of what they have to offer. So how do you manage that?
Well, let me start with our case, because I think it's an interesting one. So in our case, 88% of the shareholders, of the shareholding base, was not involved in the company. So it's kind of stupid to pay an earnout. So we devised another scheme. I'm for obvious reasons, you see, I'm the only one that stayed. I continued to get involved in the company, so I got plenty of other incentives that are not around the earnout base. But you have to think, who in your shareholding base is going to continue, because acquirers don't want to pay earnouts to people that are basically not going to be there anymore. And that's our case. So I think it depends a lot. If the founding team is 4 people and they're all going to continue, earnout makes a lot of sense. If the founding team is basically, at the time of exit, 1 person only and holds less than 20% of the shares, earnout might not be a case, and the price might be a little bit more upfront loaded. So I think it's case by case.
Yeah, I can't really comment on the deal term specific, because JSN is also a private company, so these things were not disclosed, which makes everyone's life a lot easier. What I can say is, like, from seeing other deals and just in general, is like you have to be very careful with earnouts. Like, as you say, like sometimes you're at odds with your acquirer, but also like even if the deals are very sexy, you can make $100 million in 3 years' time. Also make sure that you're in control of all the levers. Like I've heard horror stories, not in our case to be clear, where suddenly the acquirer decided to go for a hiring freeze, and they basically bought a small company with big ambitious plan, and suddenly the chairman or the CEO of the board decided like, no, the mothership is struggling a little bit financially, we had a bad quarter, no more hires for the next 6 months, which basically kills all the ambitious growth plans for the small startup with the massive earnout, and they had nothing in the contract says that they were in charge of, or they could overrule these kind of board decisions from their acquirers. So be very careful about these things. It's not just about hitting your numbers. It's also about being empowered to actually make decisions that allow you to hit these numbers, which is always going to be difficult, right? Like, an acquirer is never going to give you 100% freedom to just do whatever you want. So it is difficult. Like, that's probably, I think, deals that have an earn-out component. That's usually where most of the time is spent on actually figuring out the earn-out component and who does what and how that's going to work. Yeah.
It's complicated. Interestingly, typically only 30% of earnouts earn out, but in this industry it's the opposite, right? The vast majority do earn out, so it's something to be extremely cautious about. So post-acquisition, how do you keep the entrepreneurship alive?
Well, you don't. So that's the thing, you know. I mean, it's. I think Raf and I have similar careers. We both been corporate guys and entrepreneurs. I basically switch back and forth between the two. You need to understand it's a new reality. So why are you doing this? You are doing this because you see a different set of opportunities. You know, in our case, the first job was to consolidate the operations of Akamon and DWIP. DWIP was acquired by our company before Akamon. That's been completed. It's now, we even rebranded. It's called now Tangelo Games. And then, we've said it before, it's public information. Now we want to go in and acquire more companies because we believe there's a huge opportunity in consolidating social casino. Social casino is a baby still. And we haven't, most people think, oh, it's over now. It's 6 years, it's over now. No, it's not over. There's a lot of demand. A lot of companies are leading the industry in specific areas. But if you think about social casino, these people that have heard me before will say, oh, there he goes again. Social casino is defined by basically one type of game, which is slots, and one type of geography, which is North America. That's where the vast majority of the value has been created. Well, it's a little bit short-sighted. We believe our thesis is that there's a lot of things to do still in other categories and other geographies. And our plan is to continue consolidating the industry. Is that exciting for the former entrepreneur, now turned / corporate guy, or whatever boring name you want to put? Well, in my case, it was. So that's the decision you made.
I would not make it that strong, but I think it is true. Like, you have to just manage expectations. You're no longer a startup. Things are different. Things are, especially if you've been acquired by a larger corporation, there is going to be a little bit more overhead and rules and things that were not there when you were a smaller company. So you have to manage that as well. At the same time, I think there's a difference between entrepreneurial spirit and team morale. You have to make sure that the team still feels empowered. Like, it helps, I think, if you're still in the same office. If in our case the mothership is over the Atlantic Ocean, that helps a little bit to keep at least a feeling of autonomy and the fact that we are still
6 hours time difference. Yeah.
So that's usually like the sweet spot, I think. But these things help. Like, you have to still make sure that the team feels that that there is still a lot of the values and the culture that we created that is still intact.
I mean, one of the observations I've just had is that neither one of you are acquired by a land-based casino or a regulated company. Well, regulated in terms of gaming regulated. So that is a bit of more freedom than the other ones.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm out of time, at least I'm told, but can we take questions? Do we have time for questions? Yes, we do. We have time for questions.
Following up on Melissa's comment about deals have a length of time, I totally agree with that. Can you guys talk about what was the most time-consuming, or what lengthened the negotiation or the closing, either case, and that if you could, in hindsight, have shortened, it would have made things a lot simpler?
I can actually give one anecdote. It's actually something. We have 2 employees based in Australia. Our mathematician is based there, and one other guy. That became such a nightmare. Like, specifically, it's just all super boring tax stuff, and the fact that their retirement schedule is so different and so on. And it was something that we were aware of. And our finance director has had agreed a certain schedule, which was perfectly legal, but for a large corporation the size of Sony, it was just not good enough. So it took us weeks and weeks and weeks of going back and finding local. We had to work with PwC Australia to basically reset things, sign new contracts. That alone, those 2 guys, that basically slowed down the whole thing. I would say probably like a month and a half. So these kind of things, it's sometimes, and specifically like these days, a lot of companies have remote teams, right? Oh yeah, it's cool. We all work on Slack and Hangout, and have a guy in this country, guy in that country, and I don't know, we'll pay them with PayPal or something. Yeah, good luck with that. Good luck with that.
I am going to fully agree. Just simplify your company. Simplify it. Somebody in our company won't mention names. The founding time had the brilliant idea of putting a superseding legal entity in Malta, which obviously at the time of the first round we had to destroy and bring it back to Spain. Explaining all of that, the way in and out to Malta took us a month. So just don't do these things. Simplify.
Any other questions? Okay, then. Well, I want to thank you guys. Great session. Thanks for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.